So the purpose of this video is to talk about the components in a four-wheel drive drivetrain. And what we want to do is just go through and describe all the different components, what they do, and their impact on the system. Because we make portals, it's part of the drivetrain, and we want to tell you how they affect your system. So the big difference between two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive is that you're going to have a transfer case. And so in a two-wheel drive vehicle, your transmission is going to connect to a drive shaft that'll connect to your rear axle in rear-wheel drive, and that's going to send power, to the rear axle. In a four-wheel drive application, you're going to have a transfer case that's going to send power to your rear axle and your front axle. The transfer case, typically, like in a Jeep or a, Toyota, most vehicles that you'll buy off the lot, you're going to have a high range and a low range. The high range is going to be what you're going to use to drive around on the street. That'll be a 1-to-1 typically. So you're not going to get additional gear reduction through the transfer case. The low range will give you gear reduction. So what that means is that you're going to have, say if you have a 4-to-1 transfer case, your transmission input to the transfer case is going to have to rotate 4 times to get your output to rotate once. And what this is going to do is multiply your torque by a factor of 4 through the system, but you're going to have to drive the input 4 times faster than the output. And so RPM to torque is kind of the balancing act that you're working with there. Four-wheel drive transfer case versus all-wheel drive. So four-wheel drive, you're going to have between your rear output and your front output, they're going to be linked by either a gear set or a chain drive. And so this is going to be a rigid connection. So your rear and front drive shafts will always rotate together. Whereas in an all-wheel drive application, similar to like a rear differential where your left tire and your right tire can rotate at different rates, in an all-wheel drive application, your front and rear tires, or rear axles, can spin at different rates. And so for a street-driven vehicle, this is great because as you turn, all 4 tires are going to want to go at different rates. And so you'll be able to put power down without having to slip a tire. For four-wheel drive, if you're going off-road, you don't necessarily want that because if you've ever had an open differential on dirt, you know that it's not really two-wheel drive on the axle, it's one-wheel drive as soon as you lose traction. So if you have all-wheel drive, that could be the case where, even though you have a drivetrain linkage to all 4 tires, you're really only putting power down to 1. Out of your transfer case, you're sending power fore and aft in the vehicle and getting reduction for off-road. So, and that gear reduction could be anywhere from 2 to 4. So, moving on to drive lines. So at the transfer case, you're going to need a joint, like a U-joint or a CV joint. And then that's going to connect to a shaft that'll then connect to your differential. In the case of a solid axle, where your axle is moving with the suspension, that means that your drive line is going to have to cycle with the suspension. And that's where you need different joints, like a U-joint, a CV joint, a slip joint. So what are all these different things? A U-joint, shown here, it's basically you're going to have a cross with 4 different cups that have needle bearings in them. And so that allows this whole thing to rotate. So basically you can have a rotating shaft assembly where the input and the output are at different angles relative to each other. Drawback of a U-joint, pro to a U-joint is it's very simple. Drawback to a U-joint is that the steeper the angle between your input and your output, the more out of phase the input and the output will get. So say your input is a continuous, 1 RPM. Your output will be 1 rotation per minute as well, but it'll have, you can say, a whipping motion to it. So it won't be a constant velocity throughout that rotation. If you've ever experienced crow hop in say a front end, where your front end is locked up and you turn, your tires need to turn at different rates. Well, no, that's, I'm messing that up. So, yeah. So, in this case, say you have, what's an example? When you have your front end in four-wheel drive and you turn, right, your U-joints are out of phase with each other, left to right, so your tires want to whip at different rates, and that'll create a crow hop that'll hop the front end of the vehicle. So the next kind of joint is a CV joint, so a continuous velocity joint. Typically what you're going to see in a lot of these four-wheel drive applications is a CV joint at the transfer case and then a U joint at the pinion. And reason for this is that, like, take a Jeep for example, your drive shaft, as the suspension cycles, is going to cycle with the suspension. You're going to get most of the angular change in the drive shaft at the transfer case, and then you can kind of point the pinion at your transfer case to keep your U-joint side a little more, in phase. And hopefully, throughout cycling everything, you're mostly going to be putting power down in that more neutral area anyway. So CV joints are great. They're more expensive. You can have a couple of different types, like a Shepa, which would be a series of balls. If you've ever looked at an OE drive shaft, it's like a pancake looking joint that's basically sandwiched between a flange and the other side of the drive shaft. Or like an RCV bell, that's similar, where it's a series of balls. There's also a tripod style. I'm sure there's a more technical name for it, but it's basically 3 rollers that can plunge in and out of an input bell, I guess you could call it. So those are more typical in like independent suspension. Don't have one of those lying around right now. As it cycles with the suspension, your drive shaft pivot points at the transfer case and at the axle aren't going to mirror your suspension completely, so it needs to lengthen and shorten. So you'll have a slip joint typically. If you think back to older Jeeps, they had a slip yoke. What this was a splined drive that went into the transfer case that would allow, say you had your transfer case here, the whole drive shaft would move in and out of the transfer case. And those, they work. Obviously, the OEs were putting them in there, but they don't work as well as a slip joint in the middle of the drive shaft that allows this pivot and this pivot to be rigidly at the transfer case and the axle, and then move towards and away from each other. And then you can also have a drive shaft with a carrier bearing in it. So this is going to be a 2-piece drive shaft. You'll see these in like trucks, where from the transfer case it'll go back a little ways, and then you'll have a carrier bearing and then another joint, and then the second part of this drive shaft will cycle with the suspension. Typically from the OEs these days, it's going to be a thin wall tube with a large diameter on your drive shaft, and this is just a weight savings kind of thing. If you go to an aftermarket drive shaft, it'll be a thicker wall, more compact tube. Typically, a lot of that has to do with clearance, like on Jeeps, like JK in the front, it would hit your exhaust crossover, so you needed something with a smaller diameter and then a little bit more angle to the transfer case output. All right, so from the drive line, so you're getting power into the transfer case, sends it front and back. That's going to split your power that goes towards the front and the back, and then from your drive line it goes into your ring and pinion. So a lot of people will just say into your differential. It'll really hit this gear set before it goes to the differential. So the ring and pinion typically are going to be a hypoid gear set. You can have a pinion driving a ring, and these will have a gear ratio anywhere from mid 3s to low 5s typically for an off-road application. one of the things with gear ratio is that as you get a bigger tire, people will re-gear to get a little bit more torque back, because your vehicle was set up so that it'll run with a certain final drive that was tuned for whatever tire size your vehicle came from the factory with. As you get a bigger tire now, if you want everything to kind of balance out, you need to adjust your gear ratio to get more torque to that tire. Again, you're going to have more rotations to the input relative to the output to achieve this, but you can take some of the sluggishness away from having a larger diameter, heavier tire by re-gearing. So what that means is you're going to have a numerically higher ring and pinion gear. There are physical consequences to this. So let's take a look. These are actually slightly different gear sets. They're both out of a Jeep JK. They're both Dana 44, but this one's a front, this one's a rear. So this diameter is going to be 8.5, this one's going to be 8.8. But you can see they're fairly similar. So this is a 373 that came off of a 3.8 liter JK. And take a look at how large that pinion head is there. So, and it's a thinner gear, right? So when you have these in the differential housing, the pinion bores and the carrier bearing bores are set in space. So in order to get a different gear ratio without changing the ring gear diameter, you need to make your ring gear either thicker or thinner, and then your pinion effective diameter either larger or smaller. So this is a 373, so 3.73 input rotations to 1 output rotation versus a 538, which would be 5.38 input rotations to 1 output rotation. Again, slightly different gear sets, but you can see the difference in pinion size. And we'll have a picture of a 410 they'll both be in 8.8 for a JK rear end, and you'll be able to see the difference. So what does that mean? It means that the higher numerically you go, or the lower you gear it, the less contact you're going to have between your gear sets, and it's physically smaller. It's going to be a weaker gear set. So that's one benefit to having a numerically lower gear set, is it's a stronger gear set. So once you get through there, you're going to go to your differential. So the most typical kind of differential you'll have is an open differential. What that's going to be is a carrier. Should have brought one out here. A carrier will be attached to this ring gear, and this ring gear will spin the carrier. Inside of that carrier, you're going to have these spider gears that will whip around with the carrier housing, and then they're going to drive these side gears here. And so you have at least a 4-gear system, 2 spiders and 2 side gears. But so you can see as the carrier whips around, it's turning this gear. If you have a difference in rotational speed between your left and your right tire, these spiders and side gears will be able to rotate, so your side gears can shift relative to one another while continuing to put power down. This obviously can be not the best thing off-road, because what'll happen is as soon as you lose traction on one tire, it throws all of the power to that tire. And so as soon as you have one tire slip, it'll just continue to spin and spin and spin. So that's where limited slip differentials, locking differentials, etc. come into play. So a limited slip, if you get one from factory in your Jeep, it'll have a series of clutch packs behind. This is actually out of a limited slip differential, this side gear. It'll have some clutch packs behind it. So as it starts to slip, those will lock up and throw some of that torque to the other side. You can also have like worm drive style limited slips. That'll do essentially the same thing. I think it's Torsen. But locking differential is typically what you want off-road. You can have them electronically actuated. You can have them actuated by air. There are mechanical ones with cable actuated. But essentially what they're all doing is locking one of these side gears to the carrier. Because as soon as this side gear is locked to the carrier, then it can't rotate with your spider gear, and now the whole gear set in the middle of the differential is locked up. So that's kind of what some people do on the cheap. They'll call it a Lincoln locker. They'll weld these together, and then it'll full time be locked up left to right side. Why do you want a selectable? It's because whenever you're cornering, you do want that differentiation between your left and right tire, because if you don't have that, it'll just chirp. One of the tires will have to slip in order to be able to turn. And this can especially be a problem in the front end because they need to go at substantially different rates. If you've ever had your locker on and tried to turn off-road where you have a lot of traction, you know it can be kind of difficult. So yeah, locking differentials are great. A lot of race cars will do spools. That's just, you have no differential. It's just a carrier that's a tube with splined engagements inside of it for the axle shafts. And that gets into axle shafts. So they're gonna transmit power from the splines inside of the side gear to your wheel. In the case of a front axle shaft, that's what this would be. You need steering capability too, so you're gonna have a U-joint, CV joint to allow you to steer as well. But in a rear, it'll just be a full float or a semi-float. A lot of people are having 3/4 floats these days, but take a full float for example. It's a really simple shaft where you're just gonna have a spline engagement on both sides. So what is a spline? It's essentially a drive gear. So you're gonna cut teeth inside of this gear here, and then the splines on your shaft will engage in there. Typically in off-road, you'll hear a lot of the time 35 spline and 40 spline. So these are two standards that are just very common. So 35 spline, that'll be 1.5 inch nominal diameter. 40 spline is like 1.7 and change. And they're just really well-known standards, but the OEs will be anywhere from like a 1.2 to a 1.3 something typically when we're looking at Toyotas and Jeeps. Yeah, and a lot of times the shafts, like you might notice on our shafts, they're neck down from the spline section. So, it's not 1.5 inches all the way across. It's gonna be 1.5 inches at the splines and then neck down to like 1.38 or something like that. A little bit less than the minor diameter of the splines we cut onto the ends of the shafts. And this is just to keep the splines from twisting basically. So we're allowing torsion to happen in the shaft as opposed to, should have brought it out. We'll have a picture of what happens when you don't neck it down. Let's see. So talked about U-joints. Yeah, again, the higher angle you have on a U-joint, the more it'll have that whipping effect. So especially in steering, that becomes an issue. CV joints are great on front axle shafts. You'll see them a lot on all-wheel drives. So like, for example, the new 392s, those, I think all of them come with CV joints on their front axle shafts. Let's see, so effects of a portal on your drivetrain. So we're essentially taking a 1-to-1 output at your wheel hub and adding gear reduction in here. So like in the other examples, like in the transfer case and in your ring and pinion, you're gonna have to have a higher input to a lower output rotational speed going through the portal. And that's the trade-off for getting a little bit more torque out of the portal. But that's also, I guess, another topic as far as rotational speeds go. That's a downside to having a super high effective ratio, or final drive ratio, effective ratio, whatever you want to call it. But take a I just keep going back to Jeeps because that's what I've had, but take the 3.6 liter JK. If you put 538 gears and a 37 in there, it doesn't have a big overdrive. And so you're gonna be really whipping those drive shafts around on the highway. And that, it just decreases the life of those components. And so it's kind of a balancing act of like, how good do you want it to be off-road? What do you want your RPMs to be in your engine when you're cruising? And then, you know, what do you want the driving characteristics to be? And that's one of the reasons why, for the most part, we think a 410 is a great ratio for most of the vehicles we do, actually, because especially with some of these transmissions that are coming out, the 8 speeds, the 10 speeds, they have plenty of high gearing, they have plenty of low gearing. They're going to be happy with a 5.0 effective ratio between your ring and pinion and your portal. The other thing with gear reduction, you know, input, output, speed, but you also get multiplication of torque. That goes the other way as well. So let's say you put 1 unit of torque in here, you're going to get 1.22 units of torque out. Say you put 1.22 units of torque in here, you'll get 1 unit of torque out here. So that means that everything upstream of this this gear set is 22% stronger. So now your ring and pinion is stronger, your shafts are stronger, your drive shaft is stronger. Not only that, instead of having to run a 513 gear set to get, you know, similar to a 5.0 like you would with our setup, now you're running a 410 ring and pinion. And as we talked about before, I mean, this is a 373, we'll have a picture, but that's a much bigger gear size, and you're gonna have a lot more tooth contact. It's just gonna be stronger overall. Let's see. That's all I got in the notes, but all right. Well, those, just keep riffing. All right. I mean, that's everything I had in there, I guess. Oh, okay, I got some more stuff about ring and pinions. So let's take this guy. So this is a ring and pinion out of the rear. So front of the car would be towards me, rear of the car would be towards you. You can see the offset on this gear is down. Our pinion offset is down from center line of the ring and pinion. What that means, based on how these are cut, is that you're driving on what's called the drive side of the tooth. So these are going to be, I'm trying to think of a good way to describe it. It's like the Hoover Dam, if you've ever seen it, is it kind of has a nice curve to it. And you'll see it's curved towards the water that it's holding back, because based on that shape, that is the stronger side that it's going to be able to resist forces from. So it's the same kind of idea on a gear tooth. So for this setup in the rear, it's set up so that as it turns counterclockwise, this ring and pinion is going to move you forward. If you took this same gear set, which here is set up to go on the drive side in the rear, and you put it on the front, now you have to push on what is called the coast side of the gear tooth, which is an inherently weaker side of the tooth. So in order to combat that, what gear manufacturers have done is come out with a mirrored gear set. So this would be considered a standard cut gear set. Mirrored version of that is the reverse cut gear set. So now going this way, you're driving on the drive side of the gear to go forward. A lot of people will call them reverse rotation, and basically are high pinion versus low pinion. So, you know, this one, the standard cut gear set with counterclockwise input will push the vehicle forward in a low pinion configuration, inverse for the reverse cut. But that's why if you take a high pinion gear set from a front axle and then put it in the rear, so like say a lot of people do high pinion 60s in the rear, you'll get you know, the comment, hey, you're driving on the coast side of the gear. And that's true, but you know, with everything, there is a threshold that will be acceptable. So, you know, some people say, oh, that's not strong enough. Some people say it's plenty strong. kind of like anything else, it depends on what you're doing. But that's the downside to putting a traditional reverse cut high pinion gear set in the rear of a front engine vehicle. And then it gets even crazier, like when you have 2-gear portals or rear engine vehicles. You have to account for the difference of that input rotation. Like take a 2-gear Hummer portal, for example. That one has a standard cut gear set upside down to be able to drive on the drive side of the gear, and then it would be going backwards at your axle shafts, but that's corrected by the 2 gears and the portals. So that's one of the fascinating things about going to King of the Hammers and looking at all the different drivetrains that people have put together. It's like there are only really so many combinations, but it's interesting to see like where people have set up these different gears and where they're doing underdrives or standard cut versus reverse cut and drop boxes and portals and things like that to try and maximize the strength of the system, but make sure everything turns the right direction and that you're driving on the ideal side of the gear. Let's see. So a couple examples of ring and pinions that you've probably heard of: Dana 44, Dana 60, Dana 80, Ford 9-inch, 14 bolt, all the Toyotas. You got 8.2, 8.8. I don't know all those, but something I think is interesting about the Danas, there's 44, 60, 70, 80. Those, as far as I'm aware, if anyone knows anything different, please comment below. It's just a model number, and it specifically has to do with the gear set. So when someone says they have a Dana 60, that could mean a lot of different things, because there's a standard cut Dana 60, there's a reverse cut Dana 60, there's a 10.1-inch ring gear Dana 60, there's a several different ring and pinion combinations, and then those are in different housings as well. So just because you have a Dana 60 doesn't necessarily mean that you have top dog axle out there, because that doesn't really even actually describe what your wheel end is. It doesn't describe exactly what casting you have. It doesn't describe the tubes you have. All it really means is that you have a gear set within one of these 3 or 4 different Dana 60s that are out there. Ring gears will typically be measured by their diameter. So just to give you, I guess, a little bit of an example, like Ford 9-inch, 9 inches, it's a little under that, but pretty much that. Dana 44 is typically 8.5. In the case of JK, you'll have an 8.8 rear. The new Jeeps, they'll have M210s, M220s. That's the diameter of the ring gear in millimeters. Once you start getting into Dana 60, that's 9 3/4 or 10.1. 14 bolt Dana 80, even bigger than that. So overall, those are the components that are going to be between your transmission and your wheel that are driving your vehicle. A lot of gears, a lot of shafts, things like that. I'm sure there's stuff that I've missed. If there's anything else you're curious about, drop a comment below. Again, we're doing these videos just to try and educate and let you know what the effects of putting a portal on your vehicle are. So again, like, comment, subscribe, and if you have any questions, drop them below.